On a cold autumn morning, an old woman sat on the steps of a train station, wrapped in a torn gray shawl. People passed by without looking at her. Some threw coins into her trembling hands. Others whispered behind her back. They called her a beggar, a nobody, but none of them knew the truth. And when that truth finally came to light, the entire city would fall silent. Her name was Grace. She was 73 years old, but she looked much older. Her face was covered in deep wrinkles, her hands were rough and worn, and her eyes carried a weight that no one cared to understand. Every morning, she would sit on the same cold stone step near the central train station. She wore the same faded dress, the same torn shawl, and around her neck hung an old, tarnished necklace. It looked worthless. The metal was dull, the chain was broken in places and tied together with thread, and the small stone in the center had lost its shine long ago. People walked past her every day, thousands of them. Businessmen in expensive suits, students with backpacks, mothers holding their children's hands. Some would glance at her with pity, others with disgust. A few would toss a coin or two into the small tin cup she kept beside her. But no one ever stopped to ask her name. No one ever asked her story. Grace never begged. She never called out to anyone. She simply sat there, silent, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes watching the world go by. She had learned long ago that words meant nothing to people who had already decided what you were. The train station was always busy. It was the heart of the city, connecting neighborhoods, bringing together people from all walks of life. But for Grace, it was just another place where she existed without truly living. She had been coming here for 3 years. 3 long years of sitting in the same spot, watching the same faces rush past, feeling the same emptiness grow inside her chest. She hadn't always been like this. There was a time when Grace had a home, a real home with warm walls, soft beds, and the smell of fresh bread in the morning. She had a husband who loved her. They had been married for 42 years. His name was Thomas, and he was everything to her. He was gentle, kind, and had a laugh that could fill an entire room with joy. Thomas had been a carpenter. He built furniture with his own hands, pieces so beautiful that people would come from neighboring towns just to see his work. They didn't have much money, but they had each other, and that was enough. But life has a way of taking away the things we love most. Thomas got sick. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away. Then came the fatigue, the weight loss, the visits to doctors who shook their heads and spoke in hushed tones. Cancer. Stage 4. Inoperable. Grace spent every day by his side. She held his hand through the treatments, through the pain, through the nights when he couldn't sleep. She sold everything they had to pay for his care. The furniture, the tools, the small pieces of jewelry she had collected over the years. Everything except one thing, the necklace. Thomas had given it to her on their wedding day. It had been passed down through his family for generations. He told her it was special, that it carried the love and protection of everyone who had worn it before. He made her promise never to sell it, no matter what happened, and she kept that promise. Thomas died on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and Grace's world ended. After his death, Grace had nothing left. No savings, no home, no family. Their only son had moved abroad years ago and rarely called. She tried to reach him after Thomas died, but the number didn't work anymore. She didn't know where he was, or if he even cared. The bills piled up. The rent went unpaid. Within 3 months, Grace was evicted. She found herself on the streets with nothing but the clothes on her back and the necklace around her neck. At first, she thought it would be temporary. She thought someone would help. She went to shelters, but they were always full. She asked for work, but no one wanted to hire an elderly woman with no skills and no references. She tried everything. And slowly, painfully, she realized the truth. She had become invisible. So she found her spot at the train station. A small corner where she could sit without being in anyone's way. And that's where she stayed. One morning, a young man stopped in front of her. He was tall, with kind eyes and a warm smile. He crouched down and placed a sandwich and a bottle of water beside her cup. "Good morning," he said softly. "I hope you have a good day." Grace looked up at him, surprised. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with kindness. She nodded slowly, her lips trembling as if trying to form words, but nothing came out. The young man smiled again and walked away. For the rest of the day, Grace stared at that sandwich. She couldn't bring herself to eat it. Not because she wasn't hungry, she was always hungry, but because it reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. That somewhere in this cold, rushing world, there were still people who saw her, who remembered she was human. But the next day, the young man didn't come back. And the day after that, everything changed. It started with a man in a dark coat. He walked past Grace twice, then stopped and stared at her. His eyes weren't on her face. They were on her neck, on the necklace. He stepped closer, his gaze sharp and focused. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low. "That necklace you're wearing, where did you get it?" Grace instinctively reached up and touched the necklace, her fingers wrapped around it protectively. She said nothing. The man leaned in closer. "Do you know what that is?" She shook her head. "It's old. Very old. May I take a closer look?" Grace hesitated. Something in his voice made her uneasy. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned her face away. The man stood there for a moment longer, his eyes still locked on the necklace. Then without another word, he walked away. But Grace saw him take out his phone. She saw him typing something, and she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. That night, Grace didn't sleep. She sat in the corner of an abandoned building where she had been staying for months. The necklace lay heavy against her chest. She held it in her hand and stared at it under the dim light of a broken street lamp outside. It was the only thing she had left. The only thing that connected her to a life she had once lived. A life she had lost. She didn't know what the man had seen, but she knew one thing. Something was about to change. The next morning, Grace returned to her usual spot, but this time, she wasn't alone. The man in the dark coat was back, and he wasn't alone either. Standing beside him was a woman in an elegant suit, carrying a leather briefcase. She had sharp eyes and a serious expression. Behind them stood a security guard. Grace's heart began to race. She tried to stand up, tried to leave, but her legs were weak. The woman stepped forward and raised her hand gently. "Please, don't be afraid," the woman said. Her voice was calm but firm. "My name is Catherine. I'm an art and antique appraiser. This man contacted me yesterday. He believes the necklace you're wearing may be extremely valuable. We'd like to examine it. With your permission, of course." Grace stared at her, confused. Valuable? She had worn this necklace for decades. She had slept in the rain with it. She had gone hungry with it around her neck. How could it be valuable? I don't understand," Grace whispered. Catherine knelt down in front of her, her eyes softening. "I know this is strange, but if what we suspect is true, that necklace could change your life. Will you let us take a look? Just a look. You don't have to give it to us. It's still yours." Grace's hands trembled. She looked down at the necklace, then back at the woman. Something in her eyes felt honest. Slowly, Grace lifted the necklace over her head and handed it to Catherine. Catherine took it carefully, as if holding something sacred. She pulled out a small magnifying glass from her briefcase and examined the stone closely. Her expression changed. Her eyes widened. She looked at the man beside her, then back at the necklace. "This is it," she whispered. "This is actually it." The man's face went pale. "Are you sure?" Catherine nodded slowly. "I need to run more tests, but if I'm right, this is a Maharaja ruby, a gemstone that disappeared over 100 years ago. It was believed to be lost forever." Grace felt the world spin around her. A ruby? A Maharaja ruby? She didn't even know what that meant. Catherine looked at her with an expression that was part shock, part awe. "Grace, do you know what this means? This necklace could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe more." Grace couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. She just sat there, frozen, as the world she knew crumbled and rebuilt itself in an instant. Catherine carefully placed the necklace back into Grace's hands. "We need to take this to a professional lab. We need to authenticate it properly. But I promise you, this stays yours. No one will take it from you. Do you trust me?" Grace looked into her eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. She nodded. Catherine made arrangements immediately. She couldn't let Grace stay on the streets, not while carrying something so valuable. She took Grace to a small guest house on the outskirts of the city. It was modest but clean. There was a soft bed, warm blankets, and a bathroom with running water. Grace stood in the doorway, unable to move. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been inside a place like this. "This is yours for now," Catherine said, "until we figure everything out. You're safe here." Grace sat on the edge of the bed and cried. She cried for all the nights she had spent in the cold. She cried for Thomas, for the life they had lost, for the years of pain and loneliness. But most of all, she cried because someone finally cared. Over the next 3 days, Catherine worked tirelessly. She contacted experts, historians, gemologists, and auction houses. She sent photographs and detailed descriptions of the necklace. And with each response, the story became clearer. The necklace was real. The ruby was authentic, and its history was even more incredible than anyone had imagined. On the 4th day, Catherine returned to the guest house. She carried a folder filled with documents, photographs, and certificates. She sat down across from Grace and smiled. "Grace," she said gently, I have news, and it's going to sound impossible, but every word of it is true. She opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed a royal family from over a century ago. A king, a queen, and their children, all dressed in elaborate clothing. And around the queen's neck was a necklace, the same necklace. This, Catherine said, pointing to the image, is the Maharaja ruby. It was commissioned by a king for his wife over 150 years ago. The ruby was mined from a sacred mountain and blessed by spiritual leaders. It was said to carry protection and prosperity. When the royal family fell during a revolution, the necklace disappeared. Historians believed it was destroyed, but it wasn't. Grace stared at the photograph, her hands trembling. How, she whispered. How did my husband have it? Catherine leaned forward. We did some research. Your husband's great-grandfather was a royal guard. When the palace was attacked, he saved the queen's life. As a token of gratitude, she gave him the necklace. She told him to keep it hidden, to pass it down through his family. And he did, generation after generation, until it reached your husband. And then, tears began to stream down Grace's face. All this time, all these years, she had carried a piece of history around her neck. A piece of love, of sacrifice, of survival. And the value? She asked quietly. Catherine smiled. The gemstone alone is worth $400,000. But because of its history, its rarity, its story, collectors are willing to pay much more. We've already had offers. The highest so far is $500,000. Grace covered her mouth with her hands. She couldn't stop the tears. She couldn't stop the flood of emotions crashing over her. You're not a beggar, Grace, Catherine said softly. You never were. You're the keeper of a treasure. And now, it's time for the world to see you the way you truly are. The next few days felt like a dream Grace couldn't wake up from. Catherine had arranged everything with precision and care. Experts came to examine the necklace. Photographers documented every angle, every detail. Historians cross-referenced records and confirmed the lineage. Every test, every analysis came back with the same conclusion. The necklace was genuine. The Maharaja ruby was real. But for Grace, the weight of this discovery was more than she could carry alone. She sat in her small room at the guest house, staring at the necklace laid out on a velvet cloth on the table. It looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she saw it through different eyes. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a testament to survival, a bridge between past and present, a gift from a woman who had lost everything but chose to give hope to someone who saved her life. Grace thought about Thomas, about the day he placed this necklace around her neck. She remembered how his hands trembled slightly, how his eyes filled with tears as he whispered, "This has protected my family for generations. Now it will protect you." He knew. He must have known. Not the exact history, perhaps, but he knew it was special, and he trusted her with it. I kept my promise, Thomas, she whispered into the empty room. I never let it go. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Catherine, accompanied by a lawyer and a representative from a prestigious auction house. Grace, these people are here to help you, Catherine said gently. But before we go any further, you need to understand your options. They sat around the small table, and the lawyer explained everything in simple terms. Grace could sell the necklace privately to a collector. She could auction it publicly, which might bring in more money. Or she could donate it to a museum and receive a tax benefit along with recognition. What do you want to do, Grace? Catherine asked. This is your decision, no one else's. Grace was quiet for a long time. She looked at each face around the table, then back at the necklace. I want to think about it, she said finally. This isn't just about money. This necklace has a story. It deserves to be told properly. They all nodded and agreed to give her time. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She walked through the small garden behind the guest house, wrapped in a warm coat Catherine had given her. The stars were bright above, and the air was cool and clean. She thought about her life, about where she had been and where she was now. For 3 years, she had been invisible. People had walked past her as if she didn't exist. And yet, all along, she had been carrying something priceless. The irony wasn't lost on her. The world had judged her by her appearance, by her circumstances, never knowing that worth isn't measured by what you wear or where you sleep. She thought about all the other people like her, the ones still sitting on street corners, still invisible, still waiting for someone to see them. And she realized something profound. This wasn't just her second chance. This was an opportunity to give others the same hope she had been given. The next morning, Grace called Catherine. I've made my decision, she said. They met at a cafe, a real cafe with warm coffee and fresh pastries. Grace had forgotten what it felt like to sit somewhere like this, to be treated like a person who mattered. I want to sell the necklace, Grace said. But not to just anyone. I want it to go to a museum, somewhere people can see it and learn its story. I want them to know about the queen who gave it away to save someone's life, about the guard who kept his promise, about my husband who treasured it, and about me. Not because I'm special, but because I'm proof that you can't judge a person's worth by what they look like. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. That's beautiful, Grace. But I have a condition, Grace continued. Part of the money will rebuild my life, but the rest, I want to create something that helps people like me. People who have been forgotten. I want to build a place where they can find food, shelter, medical care, and most importantly, dignity. I want them to know they matter. Catherine reached across the table and took Grace's hand. We'll make it happen. I promise you. Within 2 weeks, the arrangements were made. A renowned museum agreed to purchase the necklace for $500,000. They would display it in a special exhibition dedicated to stories of survival, sacrifice, and hidden treasures. Grace's story would be told alongside the history of the Maharaja Ruby. The day of the transaction was overwhelming. There were cameras, journalists, museum officials, and curious onlookers. Grace stood in front of them all, wearing a simple but clean dress, her hair neatly arranged, her face calm. A journalist asked her, "Grace, how does it feel to go from having nothing to having $500,000? Grace smiled softly. "I never had nothing," she said. "I had love. I had memories. I had dignity, even when others couldn't see it. The money doesn't change who I am. It just gives me the tools to help others see their own worth." The room fell silent. People wiped their eyes. Even the hardened journalists seemed moved. The necklace was carefully placed in a secure case, and Grace signed the papers. The money was transferred to an account Catherine had helped her set up, and just like that, Grace's life transformed. But she didn't forget where she came from. 3 months later, Grace stood in front of a renovated building on the edge of the city. It had once been an abandoned warehouse, forgotten and decaying. Now it was something entirely different. The walls were freshly painted in warm colors. There were beds, showers, a kitchen, a medical clinic, and a community room filled with books and comfortable chairs. Above the entrance hung a sign, Thomas House, a place of dignity. Grace had named it after her husband. It felt right. He had given her the necklace that made this possible. This was his legacy as much as hers. Catherine stood beside her, along with volunteers, social workers, and members of the community who had donated time and resources to make this dream a reality. "Ready?" Catherine asked. Grace nodded. They opened the doors and people began to arrive. Men and women who had been living on the streets, people who had been invisible, just like Grace had been. They walked in slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid this wasn't real. Grace greeted each one personally. She shook their hands. She looked them in the eyes. She said their names. "Welcome," she told them. "You matter. You are seen. And you are safe here," many of them cried. Some hugged her. Others just stood there, overwhelmed by the simple act of being treated with kindness. Thomas House offered more than just shelter. It provided job training, counseling, medical care, and most importantly, it restored dignity. Grace had hired staff who understood what it meant to be forgotten. People who treated every guest with respect and compassion. Word spread quickly. News outlets picked up the story. Social media exploded with support. Donations poured in from around the world. People were inspired by Grace's journey, by her choice to use her fortune not for luxury, but for love. Grace became a symbol of hope, but she never let it go to her head. She still woke up early every morning and went to Thomas' house. She helped serve breakfast. She sat with people and listened to their stories. She reminded them over and over that their past didn't define their future. One day, the young man who had given her a sandwich months ago walked through the doors. He recognized her immediately. You're the woman from the train station," he said, his eyes wide. Grace smiled. "I am. And you're the young man who reminded me I was still human." "Thank you," he was stunned. "I saw your story on the news. I couldn't believe it. I just gave you a sandwich." "You gave me more than that," Grace said. "You gave me hope. And now I'm trying to do the same for others." The young man, whose name was Daniel, became one of the most dedicated volunteers at Thomas House. He said Grace had changed his life, that her story had taught him the power of small acts of kindness. Months turned into a year. Thomas House expanded. They opened a second location, then a third. Each one was funded by donations and grants, managed by people who shared Grace's vision. The museum exhibition featuring the Maharaja Ruby became one of the most visited displays. People came from all over to see the necklace, to read the story, to understand the journey of the woman who wore it. But more than the necklace, They came to learn about Grace. Schools brought students to hear her speak. Organizations invited her to share her message. And everywhere she went, she said the same thing. Everyone has value. Everyone has a story. Don't wait until someone is gone to see them. Look at them now. Speak to them now. Love them now. Grace never remarried. She never moved into a mansion or bought expensive things. She lived in a small apartment near Thomas' house, surrounded by photographs of Thomas and letters from people whose lives had been changed by her foundation. She was content. She was fulfilled. And she was no longer invisible. 2 years after Grace sold the necklace, the museum organized a special anniversary event. They invited Grace to speak, to reflect on everything that had happened since that cold autumn morning when a stranger noticed something the world had overlooked. Grace stood on the stage, looking out at hundreds of faces. Some were wealthy donors. Others were people who had stayed at Thomas' house. All of them were there because of a story that proved worth isn't found in what you own, but in who you are. When I was sitting on those train station steps, Grace began, her voice steady and clear, I thought I had lost everything. My home, my husband, my dignity. I thought the world had forgotten me. And in many ways it had. She paused, letting the silence settle. But I learned something important. Being invisible to others doesn't mean you have no value. It means they haven't learned to see. This necklace, she gestured to the display case behind her where the Maharaja ruby gleamed under soft lights, was around my neck for 3 years. 3 years of people walking past me, and not one person saw it. Not because it wasn't there, but because they had already decided what I was. People in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded. Others wiped their eyes. I don't tell you this to make you feel guilty, Grace continued. I tell you this because every single day, we all walk past people who are carrying their own treasures. Hidden pain, hidden strength, hidden stories. We walk past them because we're busy, because we're distracted, because we've learned to look away. She took a breath. But what if we didn't? What if we stopped, even for just a moment, and really saw each other? What if we spoke to the person everyone else ignores? What if we offered kindness without expecting anything in return? Grace smiled, her eyes glistening. That's what one young man did for me. He gave me a sandwich. Such a simple thing. But in that moment, he reminded me I was still human. He reminded me I still mattered. And that moment gave me the strength to keep going. Just one more day. And that one more day became everything. The room was silent except for the sound of quiet crying. The necklace changed my circumstances, Grace said. But kindness changed my heart. And if I can leave you with anything today, it's this. Be the person who sees. Be the person who cares. Be the person who makes someone else believe they matter. Because they do. We all do. The applause was thunderous. People stood. They cheered. And Grace stood there, humble and grateful, knowing that her message had reached hearts. After the event, Grace visited the necklace one more time. She stood in front of the display case, alone, staring at the ruby that had changed everything. Thank you, she whispered, for keeping your promise, for protecting me, for bringing me here. She placed her hand on the glass, and for a moment she could feel Thomas standing beside her. She could hear his voice, gentle and warm, telling her he was proud. Over the next few years, Thomas' house continued to grow. They helped thousands of people rebuild their lives. Many went on to find jobs, homes, and hope. Some even came back as volunteers, wanting to give to others what had been given to them. Grace remained the heart of it all. Even as she aged, even as her body grew weaker, her spirit never dimmed. She showed up every day with the same gentle smile, the same listening ear, the same unwavering belief that every person deserved dignity. On her 80th birthday, the community threw her a celebration at Thomas' house. Hundreds of people came. Former guests, volunteers, donors, journalists, and friends. They shared stories, laughed, cried, and thanked Grace for showing them what true compassion looked like. Daniel, the young man who had given her that sandwich years ago, stood up to speak. Grace once told me that small acts of kindness can change everything, he said. I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but now I do. Because that small act I did, giving her a sandwich, led to this. To all of you, to this foundation, to thousands of lives changed. Not because I was special, but because Grace took that kindness and multiplied it. She showed us that we all have the power to change the world, one person at a time. Grace sat in her chair, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the love surrounding her. In her final years, Grace wrote a memoir. She called it The Woman They Didn't See. It became a bestseller, inspiring millions around the world. Schools used it in their curriculum. Churches referenced it in sermons. and countless people wrote to Grace, telling her that her story had changed their perspective on life. Grace passed away peacefully at the age of 85. She died in her sleep, in her small apartment, with a photograph of Thomas in her hand. On her bedside table was the first sandwich wrapper Daniel had given her, preserved and framed. A reminder that kindness, no matter how small, can change a life. Her funeral was attended by thousands. People from all walks of life came to pay their respects. The mayor gave a speech. The museum displayed the Maharaja ruby in her honor. And Thomas House held a vigil, with every light in the building turned on, symbolizing that Grace's light would never go out. Daniel spoke at the funeral. "Grace taught us that worth isn't measured by wealth or status," he said. "It's measured by how we treat each other, by whether we choose to see or to look away, by whether we choose love or indifference. Grace chose love, every single day, and because of that, the world is better." The museum created a permanent exhibit dedicated to Grace's life. Visitors could see the Maharaja ruby, read her story, and learn about Thomas House. But the most powerful part of the exhibit was a simple quote on the wall, written in Grace's own handwriting. "I was invisible for 3 years, but I was always valuable." Don't wait for someone's circumstances to change before you see their worth. See it now. Love them now, because everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves to be seen. And so Grace's legacy lived on. Not just in the foundation that bore her husband's name, not just in the necklace displayed behind glass, but in the countless lives she touched, in the people who learned to see, in the kindness that spread like ripples in water, reaching further than anyone could have imagined. Because Grace was right. Worth isn't found in what you carry around your neck. It's found in what you carry in your heart, and hers was full of love until the very end. This story reminds us that every person we pass has a story worth hearing, a life worth honoring, and a heart worth loving. If Grace's journey touched you, share this message with someone who needs to remember their worth today. And subscribe to this channel, because every story we share is a reminder that humanity, kindness, and hope are still alive in this world. Leave a comment and tell us who in your life deserves to be seen. Let's honor them together.